There's an old proverb half forgotten now which whispers, "Not all gold is earned with honor, and not all toil ends in sleep." It's a sentiment that drifts beneath the surface of civilization. We often celebrate history's victories, the kings, the revolutions, the inventions that shaped the world. But behind each banner, raised behind every milestone carved in stone, there were hands, real, blistered hands, that bled, broke, and bore the weight of progress. This series is about them. Not the heroes sung in halls, but the people who worked in shadows. The nameless, the condemned, the indispensable, the expendable. Those with jobs so brutal, so feared, or so unlucky, they became synonymous with suffering. Professions that brought sickness, madness, stigma, and sometimes an early grave. Welcome to the most cursed jobs in history. Let's begin by asking a simple question. What makes a job cursed? It's not just danger. Plenty of occupations throughout time were risky sailors braving storms, soldiers charging into battle, blacksmiths working beside flame and iron. No, a cursed job is something else, something heavier. It's a role that brings ruin, not just to the body, but to the spirit. Work that no one truly chooses, only inherits or accepts through desperation. It's often thankless, often hidden, and always haunted by misfortune. Sometimes the job itself was shrouded in superstition. Other times the curse came later, revealed only through centuries of suffering. A cursed job is one that history tries to forget, even as it builds itself upon the backs of those who did it. Over the next 20 parts, we'll explore some of the most chilling, sorrowful, and darkly fascinating professions to ever exist. From the plague burial crews of 14th century Europe to the mad hatters poisoned by mercury fumes. From executioners bound by law and loathing to children, lowered into chimneys to clean soot by candlelight. Well, travel through ages and empires, into tombs and factories, through arsenic-laced wallpaper and cursed mummies, into mines so deep the air itself rebelled. You'll meet rat catchers and gong farmers, sin eaters, and resurrection men, leech collectors and match girls, all trapped by roles they didn't design but could not escape. And we'll ask, why do these jobs exist? What societal cracks did they fill? What cost did they extract from those who took them? But first, a brief pause to understand the framework of historical labor. You see, work hasn't always been about meaning or fulfillment. That's a relatively modern notion. For most of human history, your job was determined by where you were born, who your parents were, or whether you could survive the seasons. If your father was a tanner, you likely became a tanner. If your village had no clean water, and someone had to dig the night soil pits, that someone was you. There was no application process, no upward mobility. In fact, many so-called dirty jobs came with a permanent stain, not just literal, but social. To touch the dead was to be considered unclean. To work with fire and bone was to walk a fine line between holy and heretic. To deal with human waste, or with bodies, or with blood, was to be marked. And yet these roles were vital. Every great city had its waste removers. Every battlefield had its corpse gatherers. Every castle had its rat catchers, its plague watchers, its silent cleaners. Civilization stands only because someone was cursed to crawl beneath it. Let's pause for a moment and consider one of the oldest cursed jobs, the tomb guardian. In ancient Egypt, tombs were not simply burial places, they were gateways, portals between life and eternity. and those charged with constructing or protecting these sites often lived under terrifying pressure. A single wrong chisel stroke on a pharaoh's coffin could mean death. Disturbing sacred objects, accidentally or otherwise, was seen as an offense not just to the king, but to the gods themselves. And when tombs were desecrated by looters, as many were, suspicion often fell on those who worked nearby: stonemasons, scribes, even painters. To be accused was to be punished harshly. Limbs were severed, families exiled, and worse still, many believed that those who even touched a royal tomb without the proper prayers would carry a curse upon their soul for eternity. Some archaeologists now speculate that the very idea of the mummy's curse may have originated from this timer method of social control, ensuring workers respected the sanctity of royal burial chambers. But real or not, the fear clung to them, just as mercury clung to the hatters of the Victorian age, just as the Black Death clung to the clothes of those forced to bury the infected. Each episode of this series will be a window into one of these roles. You'll hear their stories, the facts, the superstitions, the heartbreak. We won't romanticize their suffering, but we will remember it. Because these jobs, these cursed, ugly, foul-smelling, back-breaking, dignity-stripping jobs held the world together. And often the people who did them died nameless. Let us give them names. So, draw the curtains, settle into the stillness, and let us begin our descent into the forgotten underbelly of labor, where wages were measured not in coin, but in consequence. Continue well meet the gong farmers' men, whose entire livelihood revolved around collecting, hauling, and disposing of human waste in the medieval cities of England. It's a story of stench, sickness, shame, and surprising power, because sometimes the most cursed workers were the ones closest to the truth. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the narrow, winding streets of medieval London. It's the year 1347. The air hangs thick with the sour scent of ale, sweat, rotting vegetables, and something far worse. Something no amount of lavender or rosewater can cover. Human waste. Every house has a cesspit or a privy. Some overflow into the gutters. Others are deeper built to last, but still fill eventually. Chamber pots are emptied into ditches. Livestock wander freely. And beneath all this, in the bowels of the city, someone has to deal with what everyone leaves behind. Enter the gong farmer. Gong in this case doesn't mean bell. It comes from the Old English word gang, meaning to go. So a gong was quite literally what one went to do. The gong farmer's job was simple in description, but horrifying in execution: to dig out, collect, and transport human excrement from the city's cesspits by hand at night, with little more than a shovel, a bucket, and a strong stomach. These men were sometimes also called nightmen, because their work had to be done after dark under cover of night. Not out of shame, though there was plenty of that, but for practicality. Streets were too busy during the day, and the stench was too unbearable for the average passerby. You'd see them pushing wooden carts or dragging barrels, often barefoot, slopping through the alleys of Southwark or Bishopsgate, leaving a trail you'd rather not follow. They wore thick leather aprons and tied rags around their faces soaked in vinegar or mint. But it was never enough. The smell seeped into their skin, their hair, their souls. There are accounts of gong farmers being banned from taverns and churches, not for moral failings, but because no one could sit beside them without gagging. Even the rats kept their distance. The pay, surprisingly, was decent. In fact, being a gong farmer could earn you more than a skilled tradesman like a carpenter or mason. Why? Because no one else wanted to do it. The city needed them, desperately. A block cesspit could overflow into the street. A neglected privy could infect a whole tenement. In the cramped, filthy conditions of the time plague and dysentery were never more than a few steps away. So the gong farmers worked, and were paid sometimes generously, but they paid for it in other ways. Firstly, there was the danger. Cesspits were deep, often 10-15 feet down. They were poorly ventilated. Toxic gases would build up methane, hydrogen, sulfide, carbon dioxide. Many gong farmers died in the pits, overcome by fumes. Some simply fainted and drowned in the very filth they were meant to remove. There are grim tales from York and Bristol of men being pulled out days later, their skin pale, their lungs full, their pockets still jingling with the coins they'd earned the night before. Secondly, there was disease. Though they didn't know the word bacteria, the people of the time understood that those who handled waste often got sick. Boils, rashes, fevers, missing teeth, coughs that never went away, and yet they worked. Because work, however foul, meant survival. Perhaps most cruelly of all was the social curse. To be a gong farmer was to be marked. Children ran from them. Women crossed themselves. Priests refused confession unless they bathed, which was nearly impossible when every pore reeked of human decay. They were essential to society but utterly outcast from it. An invisible wall stood between them and the rest of the world. They could not marry outside their station, could not inherit land, could not give their children a trade beyond their own. And still they worked, because someone had to. But here's the twist in the tale. Gong farmers had power. You see, the waste they collected wasn't just thrown away. It was often sold to farmers, to dyers, to tanners. Human waste known as night soil was used as fertilizer and in certain medieval crafts. So, a clever gong farmer, especially one with a regular route, could supplement his income by selling what he scraped up. Some even banded together to form early cooperatives controlling prices and territory. There were disputes, fights, even arrests. The night soil wars of the late 1400s, yes, that's a real phrase, saw rival gangs of gong farmers competing for access to the largest, wealthiest homes with the deepest pits. It was undignified, it was vile, but it was business. By the 17th century, gong farmers had become official civil servants in some cities. Their roots were recorded, their fees taxed, their deaths barely mentioned. Even as sewers were developed, the gong farmer remained. Right into the industrial age, right into the era of gaslight and newspapers. And still they were forgotten. History does not remember their names, but it remembers their absence. Every time a city fell to disease or collapse, the silent question was always, who's cleaning beneath us? The next time you flush a toilet, or pass a sewer grate, or see a sanitation truck clanking through the morning fog spare, a thought for the men who climbed into the pits with nothing but a bucket and a prayer. They were cursed by trade, but blessed by necessity. And for a few hundred years, they held the health of entire cities in their hands. Covered in muck, wreathed in stench, ignored. Continue, we travel east to Imperial China, where the most cursed job wasn't down in a pit, but inside a palace. There the eunuchs served emperors, castrated, manipulated, despised, and sometimes rose to terrifying power. But the price of their role unthinkable. Let's uncover it next. When one imagines the Forbidden City, the image is often a romantic one. Golden roofs glinting in the sunlight, silken robes sweeping over marble floors, the air perfumed with incense and jasmine. It was a palace of perfection, order, and ritual. But beneath the surface, behind those lacquered doors, lived men whose lives were defined by silence, sacrifice, and sorrow. They were the emperor's most trusted servants. They were the eunuchs. And few roles in history came with such a brutal cost. Let us begin plainly with the truth. To become a eunuch was to be castrated entirely. In China, during much of the imperial era, this included the removal of both the testicles and the penis. It was done without anesthesia, often by unlicensed backroom practitioners, sometimes on kitchen floors. The wound was sealed with ash or oil. If the man survived the bleeding and infection, he was bound in tight cloth and expected to walk within days. Those who didn't survive were simply buried in unmarked graves. Those who did were changed, physically, socially, spiritually. Why would anyone choose this? Sometimes they didn't. Boys were sold by desperate families. Slaves were offered as tribute. In other cases, men submitted themselves willingly, believing it was the only way to escape poverty. It was said that eunuchs had only 3 paths in life: death, obscurity, or power. And indeed, power was very much on offer, because eunuchs were allowed inside. Inside the palace, inside the emperor's quarters, inside the private chambers of the imperial harem, where no other man could legally or morally step foot. They were trusted to carry secrets, relay messages, deliver justice. They became gatekeepers, advisors, even kingmakers. Some eunuchs rose to unimaginable influence. Take Wei Zhongxian, for example, owner of the most powerful eunuchs in Ming Dynasty China. In the 1620s, he controlled court appointments, influenced royal decrees, and executed rivals with little more than a whisper. Statues were erected in his honor. Officials bowed to him. The emperor himself feared displeasing him, but his power was brittle. The moment the emperor died, wise enemies closed in. He was stripped of title status and safety. He took his own life rather than face the humiliation of public execution. This was the double-edged sword of eunuchdom. To rise was to be envied. To fall was to be erased. The daily life of a palace eunuch was no less cursed. They served in silence for hours upon hours. They rose before dawn to prepare the emperor's garments, bow a dozen times before breakfast, and ensure that every word, gesture, and gaze followed the script of ritual. Even minor mistakes, stepping too close, speaking out of turn, delivering bad news improperly, could mean lashes, exile, or death. Eunuchs were taught to walk lightly, speak softly, and smile always. Their emotions were irrelevant, their desires forbidden, their names often changed. Outside the palace, they were seen as unnatural. They occupied an uneasy space. Not quite man, not quite woman, not monk, not soldier. Some feared them, others mocked them. They were denied the ability to marry, forbidden from having children. Many suffered from hormonal imbalance, obesity, high-pitched voices, brittle bones. Their bodies became reminders of the price they'd paid to stand so close to power. Even in death, the curse lingered. It was customary to preserve the severed genitalia in a jar, so that upon death, it could be buried with the body, restoring in a symbolic way the man's wholeness. Those jars were kept hidden, passed down secretly, often lost or stolen. Without it, some believed the eunuch's soul would wander incomplete. And yet, for all the suffering, many eunuchs clung to their role, because for some, it was still better than the life they'd left behind. They had food, silk robes, a roof over their heads, books if they could read, influence if they learned to wield it wisely. They saw the inner workings of the empire, witnessed weddings, coronations, betrayals, miracles. They touched the pulse of history from the inside out, even as it slowly wore them away. There were stories to quiet ones of kindness. Some eunuchs became guardians to young palace boys, teaching them the ways of survival. Some risked their lives to protect concubines during times of invasion or rebellion. Some served old, forgotten emperors who had lost their thrones, staying by their side long after the court had turned away. But these tales rarely made the records. History prefers the extremes tyrants or martyrs, the rest are swept into dust. By the end of the Qing dynasty, eunuchs were fading from public life. The last known imperial eunuch, Sun Yao-ting, lived until 1996. In his final years, he gave interviews, shared memories, and revealed the loneliness of a life spent serving a vanished world. He had no children, no grave until strangers gave him one. His name almost disappeared like so many who came before him. To be a eunuch was to sacrifice everything you were for the chance to be near the heartbeat of power. But the heart does not always love those closest to it, and power does not weep when it breaks those who serve it. Come next, well journey west, into the damp corridors of 19th century England, where another cursed job thrived. Not in palaces, but in graveyards. Their resurrection men crept through the night, stealing bodies to feed a booming medical industry. But as you'll learn, the dead weren't always the ones taken. In the damp chill of an Edinburgh night, the churchyard lies quiet. Fog clings low between the tombstones. The air smells of peat moss and something darker, something freshly disturbed. Beneath the moonlight, two men crouch by a mound of newly turned soil. One carries a wooden spade, the other holds a sack and a hook. They are not grieving, they are working. And their job, to steal the dead. In the early 19th century, medical science was booming. Surgeons wanted to understand the human body, its organs, its nerves, the secrets that lay beneath the skin. But dissection was a controversial practice legally reserved only for the bodies of executed criminals. That supply was woefully small. The demand, however, was immense. Medical schools in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin were desperate for cadavers. And where there is demand, especially lucrative demand, there will always be someone willing to meet it, no matter the cost. Enter the resurrection men, also called body snatchers. These individuals prowled cemeteries by night, digging up the freshly buried before the soil had time to settle. Their work was not rooted in science nor in curiosity. It was pure economics. They were paid per corpse by medical colleges. Young, healthy-looking bodies fetched more. Children, tragically, were worth even more per weight, small, easy to carry, and particularly prized by anatomy schools training future surgeons. It was a gruesome business, but a booming one. The public were horrified, not because they were sentimental about the dead, though many were, but because in the Christian worldview of the time, disturbing a corpse jeopardized its resurrection at the day of judgment. To die was one thing. To be denied your rest was another. Families began to take precautions. Iron cages called mort safes were installed over graves. Coffins were weighted with stone. Watchmen were hired. And in some cases, loved ones stood vigil for weeks to ensure their kin remained where they'd been laid. But the resurrection men were clever. They struck fast, usually within 24 hours of burial, digging only at the head of the grave, breaking the lid, hooking the corpse out by the neck, and reburying the rest to avoid suspicion. They worked in silence with practiced speed, and by dawn they were gone. One of the most notorious cases was not in fact about body snatching, but about its next logical step. William Burke and William Hare, two Irish immigrants living in Edinburgh, discovered an easier method than digging murder. In 1828, after selling the body of a deceased tenant to a Dr. Robert Knox at the city's anatomy school, They realized the potential profit of supplying fresh corpses. But rather than wait for people to die naturally, they simply began killing. They used a technique now known as burking, suffocating victims, without leaving marks, ensuring the bodies looked undamaged and healthy. They murdered at least 16 people this way. The doctors asked no questions, and the money flowed. Eventually they were caught. Hare turned informant. Burke was hanged before a massive crowd, then publicly dissected, his skeleton displayed in a museum, a macabre footnote to the very system he once supplied. Ironically, he became what he'd once sold a specimen. The scandal shook the medical world. Reforms followed. The Anatomy Act of 1832 changed everything, granting legal access to unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals, and ending the reliance on grave robbers. It was a necessary shift, but one built on the backs of the poor and the forgotten. Because now, instead of stealing bodies from graves, the system simply took them from those who had no voice to object. The resurrection men faded from the churchyards, but the ethics of medicine remained complicated. Who were these body snatchers truly? They were not all villains. Many were simply desperate. Unemployed laborers, former soldiers, men too old for industry, too rough for polite work. Some were even hired by doctors directly. They worked at the edge of law and morality, despised by the public, needed by science, forgotten by history. And let us not forget the emotional cost. Imagine carrying a child's body across cobbled streets at night, knowing you might be caught beaten or killed. Imagine the smell, the weight, the silence of the corpse you never knew but now must deliver like produce to a butcher. It was not a job taken lightly, but it was taken, because survival leaves little room for dignity. There are stories still buried in old records, of mothers chasing grave robbers with kitchen knives, of a gang in London caught when a dog dug up a discarded arm, of surgeons quietly passing coins in back alleys, eyes lowered, collars high, of towns where entire rows of graves were found empty, the wood of the coffins splintered and clawed. The ground remembers, even if we don't. Today we learn about anatomy in clean white labs. We dissect plastic models. We peer into digital bodies on glowing screens. But once the path to knowledge ran through churchyards and through the hands of men who carried the dead on their backs, hoping to reach the school before morning, and praying no one recognized the face beneath the cloth. Next, we descend even deeper into the sewers of Victorian London. There we meet the Toshera man who made his living sifting through human filth for lost coins, jewelry, and hope. Another cursed job. Another tale history flushed away. The Thames runs slow beneath the bridges of London, but beneath that, below the surface of polite society, flows something older, something darker. A network of tunnels, a labyrinth of stone and muck and stink. This is the underworld, and in the mid-19th century it was home to a peculiar breed of worker, the tosher. By day they were invisible ghosts with mud-caked boots and sharp eyes. By night they descended. Torch in one hand, sack in the other, they waded through waist-deep sewage, hoping to catch the glint of something valuable in the filth. Coins, buttons, cutlery, pocket watches, rings, bones, anything the river or the city had swallowed they claimed. It was grim work, foul work, dangerous beyond measure, but it was honest in its way, and for some it was the only option left. The toshers took their name from the slang term tosh, meaning any scrap or metal item that could be sold on. Their profession thrived during the early Victorian era, before London's sewer system was fully modernized. Back then, much of the city's waste flowed straight into the Thames and its tributaries. Old Roman drains, medieval culverts, and makeshift sluices created a tangled web beneath the cobbles. Most Londoners never thought about it, but the Toshers lived in it. They worked in teams or alone, slipping through manholes or climbing down hidden entrances, known only to their trade. Some wore heavy boots and thick leather aprons. Others stripped to the waist to move more freely. They carried long poles tipped with hooks or magnets. Some had sieves, others used their bare hands. They moved silently, listening for the sound of shifting sludge or worse, sudden rushes of water. Because here's the thing, toshing wasn't just disgusting, it was lethal. Sewer gas, hydrogen, sulfide and methane could suffocate a man in seconds. One misstep on a slime-slick pipe and you'd crack your skull on the stone. Rats were everywhere, hungry, bold, disease-ridden. And if a storm hit upstream, the tunnels could flood without warning, washing a man straight into the Thames. Some Toshers vanished, never seen again. Others reappeared, face down, bloated, caught in the roots along the riverbank. But the risk was worth it sometimes. A Tosher could find a sovereign or two in a lucky night enough to feed a family for a week. One rumor spoke of a man who discovered an entire jeweled brooch washed down during a robbery. Most found nails, scraps of tin, rusty spoons. Still, it was better than the workhouse. The Toshers formed a kind of hidden guild, no written rules but fierce customs. Newcomers had to earn their keep. Veterans guarded their favorite tunnels jealously. Fights broke out. Tools were stolen. Some entrances were booby-trapped to keep rivals out. And despite the grime, they had a strange sort of pride. It was a hard life, but it was their life. And they understood London better than any lord in Parliament. They weren't entirely beyond the law either. Technically, trespassing in the sewers was illegal. The city authorities would arrest Toshers when they were caught. But enforcement was patchy. Many officers turned a blind eye, especially if the Tosher shared some of his findings. It was a game of cat and rat played in shadows and stink. Charles Dickens himself wrote about them. He described them in sketches by Boz as tattered, lean and unshaven men who slip silently through the grate and vanish into the city's bowels. He understood their poetry in a way, their resilience, their desperation. They were not criminals, but they were not quite citizens either. Just another layer of the city's great machine. The worst time of year was summer, when the heat thickened the air and the sewage festered like stew. When cholera crept through the water and clung to the flesh. To work in the tunnels during those months was to gamble with death. Some wore cloths soaked in vinegar over their mouths. Others simply coughed and carried on. What choice did they have? Then came the great stink of 1858. The Thames turned black. The smell became unbearable. Parliament nearly fled the city. It was the final push needed for reform. Soon after, under the brilliant engineer Joseph Bazalgette, London began to build a vast modern sewer system, brick-lined, ventilated, mapped. The city rose, the underworld shrank, and the Toshers. They faded, their trade disappeared. Their names washed away like everything else they'd once pulled from the filth. Today they're barely remembered. No statues, no plaques, just stories passed down in whispers. Of men who walked in rivers of waste for the chance of a coin. Men who knew every bend beneath Blackfriars, every whisper under Westminster. Men who were cursed by trade but not by choice. Sometimes you may still hear about urban explorers, those who venture into the disused sewers for thrill or photos. They walk in the ghosts of Toshers, but they do not carry the same burden. Because the Tosher didn't descend for adventure. He went because his family was hungry. Because the workhouse was colder than the sewer. Because the riverbed, foul and forgotten, held just enough hope to keep him going. Next, we move from the underworld to the stars. but not the kind you'd expect. We meet the match girls of Victorian England factory workers, whose bones glowed in the dark, their jaws slowly eaten away by the very product they made. Their job lit the world and cost them their faces. In the flicker of a single match we see light, warmth, comfort, progress. But in Victorian England, behind each small flame lay a far darker truth etched into the faces of girls too poor to refuse, too young to escape. They worked in silence under gas lamps and factory bells, their fingers moving faster than thought, dipping wooden sticks into chemicals that sparkled like moonlight and killed like poison. They were the match girls, and their job was one of the most cursed in modern history. The matchstick, so simple, so ordinary, was a technological marvel of its time. It allowed people to light stoves, candles, lamps, and cigarettes without flint steel or friction. It turned homes into havens. It made fire portable, and it was powered by white phosphorus, a substance that glowed in the dark, that hissed when wet, that smelled sweet, almost garlic-like, and that in the hands of the poor destroyed from within. In the match factories of London's East End, most notably the Bryant and May factory in Boulogne, girls and women made thousands of matches a day. They dipped, stacked, boxed, and wrapped for hours, for pennies. They were known by their white-stained fingers, their chemical-streaked aprons, their soot-rimmed eyes. Some were as young as 12, others even younger, though the factory claimed otherwise. They were expendable, easily replaced, but not easily forgotten. The real horror came not in the labor, but in the chemical. White phosphorus is highly toxic. When inhaled or ingested, often through licking fingers, eating in the workroom, or simply breathing its fumes, it attacked the body from within. The most notorious consequence was something called phossy jaw. It began as a toothache. Then the jaw swelled, the gums turned green, the breath soured like rot. Soon the bone itself began to die, blackened, crumbling. Eventually pieces of the jaw would fall away, holes opened in the face. The girls lived in agony, disfigured, shunned, and slowly poisoned to death. There was no cure, only surgery and silence. Management knew, of course. There were records, inquiries, whispers. But white phosphorus was cheaper than its safer alternatives, and profit came before people. So the girls kept working, because if they didn't, someone else would. And there were always more mouths to feed. The match girls did not go quietly, however. In 1888, a strike began. It started small over fines, poor conditions, and unfair treatment. But it quickly grew. Hundreds of women and girls walked out of the Bryant and May factory, led by a woman named Annie Besant, a journalist and reformer who had exposed the conditions within. The factory owners tried to silence her. They failed. The public rallied. Parliament took notice. And after 3 weeks of protests and pressure, the company backed down. The girls won better pay, slightly improved conditions, recognition. It was one of the earliest and most powerful examples of female industrial action in British history. But the phosphorus remained, and so did the danger. It wasn't until 1906 that white phosphorus was finally banned in the UK for match production after decades of lobbying by doctors' unions and reformers. Safer substitutes like red phosphorus took its place. But for many of the match girls, the damage was done. They were scarred, deformed, forgotten, and they had lit the world at the cost of their faces. Their story isn't just a tale of labor abuse, it's a mirror to the way society treats those it doesn't see. They were young, poor, female, and voiceless, until they weren't, until they spoke, until they marched out of the factory gates and into history. Jaws, aching fingers, trembling hearts, aflame with something no match could hold. Today you can visit the old Bryant and May factory. It still stands converted into flats and offices. But beneath the polished floors and bright windows, the past lingers. You can almost hear the echo of footsteps, the click of matchboxes, the laughter of girls pretending not to notice the pain in their mouths. Their legacy is not just in books or museums. It's in every act of protest, every strike, every time someone says we deserve better. They carried the curse. But they didn't carry it quietly. Come next, we turn to the battlefield, not to soldiers, but to the trench cleaners and battlefield corpse collectors of the First World War. Their duty was to restore order after slaughter, to gather what was left of men, to stand in places where even the birds refused to land. The guns fall silent. The sky long choked with smoke and metal clears, just enough to let a sliver of pale light touch the craters. All around the trench is still, not quiet, not truly, because even after the battle ends, it echoes through the moaning of wounded men, the buzzing of flies, and the thick, wet sound of boots pulling free from mud that's more blood than soil. And in that terrible stillness, another kind of soldier steps forward. One with no anthem, no glory, no medals. The cleanup crews, the trench workers, the corpse collectors, the men whose job it was to restore order to hell. When we imagine the First World War, we often think of the fighting, the charges, the shells, the bayonets. But behind every offensive was an aftermath, and someone had to clean it up. That task fell to a mixture of medical orderlies, burial details, engineers, and labor corpsmen, often pulled from colonial regiments or assigned after disciplinary action. It was a role no one wanted, but one that couldn't be avoided. Because a battlefield left uncleared was not just indecent, it was deadly. The Western Front was a morass of filth and death. After major offensives like the Somme or Passchendaele, the fields were littered with bodies. British, French, German, intertwined, half-buried, stripped by shrapnel, crawling with vermin. Some lay for weeks. Others sank slowly into the mud, lost forever. Those that remained were bloated, distorted, unrecognizable. And yet, the men assigned to this cursed task had to find them, identify them, tag them, bury them, sometimes rebury them when shell fire tore open old graves. It was relentless, emotional, nauseating work, and utterly necessary. Identification was key. Each soldier wore a pair of tags. One remained with the body, the other was removed and logged. But in many cases, the body was in pieces, or burned, or so far decomposed that even touching it risked illness. Still they tried, using letters from pockets, boots, ribbons, rings, because to not identify a fallen man was to leave a family in limbo. So the trench workers bent down, covered their noses, and reached into ruin. Burial, when it came, was often hurried. Mass graves were common in early battles. Later, as the war dragged on, greater care was taken. Cemeteries grew, first temporary, then permanent. But digging graves in ground churned by artillery was nearly impossible. Mud collapsed. Water filled the holes. Bodies shifted, floated, sank. In winter, the earth froze hard as iron. Picks bounced off it like stone. In summer, the stench was unbearable. The men who dug graves sometimes fainted from it. Others vomited. Some never ate meat again. Then there were the trench cleaners. These men weren't always dealing with the dead. Sometimes their job was to make trenches passable again after shelling. That meant removing collapsed walls, draining water, repairing duckboards, and yes, removing pieces of soldiers embedded in the timber or blown into the dirt. They carried shovels, picks, buckets. They worked around unexploded shells. They risked disease from rats, lice, gangrene, dysentery. And still they worked. because if they didn't, the trench couldn't be held, and others would die. Among the worst duties was clearing no man's land. After a failed charge, the space between trenches was often littered with the wounded and the dead. Anyone moving there in daylight was a target for snipers, so the crews went at night, dragging bodies back under fire, listening for cries in the dark, praying they wouldn't be shot by their own sentries. Some lost their minds, some drank themselves senseless between duties, some wrote poems just to keep from forgetting who they were. Perhaps the most tragic were the graves registration units. These were the men sent in after the war ended to locate, record, and properly rebury the dead. They scoured old battlefields long since grown over, used maps, notes, photos, dug by hand, found bones, helmets, bayonets, watches, whole skeletons curled as if still praying. They exhumed hundreds, thousands, many were never identified. Their markers read only, "A soldier of the Great War, known unto God." We don't talk about these men much. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't storm trenches or take cities, but they preserved dignity. They turned horror into memory. They built the cemeteries we visit today, rows upon rows of white stone carved with names that might otherwise have been lost. They gave shape to the cost of war, and they carried that cost with them. There are stories, mostly in letters and memoirs, of trench workers who went home and never spoke of what they'd seen, of men who couldn't sleep without nightmares, of others who returned to the fields as volunteers, unable to leave the dead behind. Because once you've picked up the pieces of someone else's son, you don't quite forget. And once you've walked through a field of bodies, every step after feels quieter. In Next, we travel back in time, but no less close to death. There we meet the sin eater, a figure who for a coin or a crust of bread would take on the sins of the dying so their soul could rise clean, while his own sank deeper with each bite. Imagine a room lit only by a single candle. A body lies on the table, still warm, shrouded in linen. The mourners whisper prayers. The priest has come and gone. And then just before the lid is nailed shut, a man steps forward. He's not part of the family, not a friend, not welcome, but he's necessary. In his hands is a piece of bread. On his lips, a prayer not from scripture, but older, rough whispered, almost forgotten. He places the bread upon the corpse's chest, then eats it, and in doing so takes upon himself all the sins of the deceased. He is a sin eater, and no one will sit beside him when the meal is done. The practice of sin eating existed in Britain and parts of rural Europe, especially in Wales, the Scottish borders, and isolated regions of England. It was never sanctioned by the church, indeed, it was condemned outright. But among the poor, the fearful, and the superstitious, it lingered, because death was terrifying, and damnation more so, especially for those who died unconfessed, unshriven, unblessed. And when a priest couldn't tour, wouldn't come in time, people turned to the only one who would answer the knock, the man who swallowed sins. The ritual was simple: a piece of bread or a small meal, sometimes cheese, ale, or cake, was placed on or near the corpse, symbolically absorbing the sins of the departed. Then the sin eater consumed it. Some recited short prayers, others said nothing at all. In some regions, a coin was placed on the chest as payment. In others, the food itself was the fee. The transaction was unspoken. The meaning was clear. One soul was being lightened, another was being burdened. The sin eater was never a man of prestige. He lived on the edges of the village, figuratively and often literally. Alone, shunned, distrusted. Seen as half pagan, half outcast, fully necessary. Children were warned not to stare at him. Women crossed themselves when he passed. No one shared a table with him at the inn. He was believed to carry dozens of souls, since murder, adultery, theft, lies, all heaped upon his shoulders, like an invisible plague. People feared that to even brush against him was to invite misfortune. And yet when death came close, they sent for him. Every time. Who were these men? Many were destitute, old, crippled, disfigured, too poor for another trade, too rough for the church. Some were drunkards, others were devout in their own strange way. Some saw it as a calling, others as a curse. All carried it in silence. There are no records of sin-eaters speaking publicly, writing memoirs, or justifying their work. Only graves rarely marked, and stories passed down in whispers. One such tale comes from Shropshire. A man named Richard Munslow served as a sin-eater well into the 19th century, long after the practice had supposedly died out. Unusually, he was not a pauper, but a relatively well-off farmer. Some say he revived the ritual after the death of his children, desperate to spare others the pain of an uncertain afterlife. His grave still stands marked by those who remembered not just what he did, but why. Because beneath the superstition, there was compassion, a wish to ease the passing of a soul, even at personal cost. There is something deeply human in the concept of the sin-eater. It echoes across faiths and folklore. The idea of substitution, of one suffering for another, of a scapegoat who takes the guilt of the tribe. But unlike messiahs or martyrs, the sin-eater had no altar, no hymns, no followers, just a crust of bread, a bowed head, and silence. As the church's reach grew and rural beliefs faded, the practice was driven underground. By the 19th century, it was all but extinct. No clergy would officiate, no government would acknowledge, and yet in some corners it persisted, especially in places where death came often and priests came late, where the fear of hell outweighed the fear of gossip, and where one man's loneliness could grant another man peace. The sin-eater left no legacy, no children, no disciples, no liturgy, but perhaps that was the point, to carry what others would not. To be forgotten in life so that others might be remembered in death. To eat the curse and become the curse. Today the idea survives mostly in metaphor. We call people scapegoats. We speak of emotional burdens and carrying guilt. We ask others to take the blame. But once it was literal. Once a man stood in the corner of the death room and ate a piece of bread that no one else dared touch. And when he walked out into the night, the family sighed with relief, because someone had taken the weight. Next, we look not to the dead, but to the dying, and those forced to usher them from life to death. We meet the executioners of history, men paid to kill, men cursed by blood, and men who found in their duty a kind of prison no cell could hold. The bell tolls. The crowd gathers. A platform has been raised in the town square, its timber dark with old stains. Children perch on shoulders. Merchants pause their trade. A strange hush lingers in the air, thick with anticipation. And then he steps forward. The executioner. Not a judge, not a soldier, not a priest, but something in between. His job is not to kill, it is to end cleanly, quickly, and publicly. A hand that delivers justice, a blade that knows no forgiveness. For centuries, executioners occupied a strange and terrible position in society. They were vital to the state symbols of law, order, and punishment. Without them, kings could not rule and courts could not command fear. But they were also outcasts, shunned, feared, even hated, because while their hands held the sword, their hearts bore the stain. No matter how skilled, how precise, how necessary they were, still killers. And the blood didn't wash off. In medieval Europe, executioners were often born into the role. It passed from father to son like a curse stitched into the family name. Others came to it by accident or desperation. A criminal offered a pardon if he agreed to swing the axe. A butcher skilled with knives pressed into royal service. A soldier with steady hands paid more to end than to fight. The state did not care who they were, only what they could do, and whether they could do it without flinching. The tools of the trade varied. In England, the axe was most common. In France, the sword. Later, the guillotine. Elsewhere, the rope. Each required a different kind of precision. Each left its own mark. A skilled executioner could take a head in one blow, merciful, clean, almost elegant. A poor one he'd hack and hack again and again. The crowd would gasp, the condemned would scream, and the executioner would carry that failure forever. But their work did not end with the blade. Executioners were also torturers, body disposers, limb collectors. They boiled heads for public display, tarred traitors' limbs for the gates, burned witches, broke wheels, drew and quartered. They prepared the condemned, stripped them, bound them, whispered final words. Some offered comfort. Others did not speak at all. Some prayed for the dying. Some never prayed again. The pay was meager, but included perks, the clothes of the condemned, their final coins, occasionally a meal or drink. Some towns offered lodging on the outskirts. Always the outskirts, because no one wanted to live beside the man who ended lives, even if they queued to watch him work. Public executions were theatre. Thousands came to see them, to jeer, to cheer, to judge. The executioner stood center stage, hooded or barefaced, bearing all the weight of the state and all the scorn of the street. One sleep, a trembling hand, a broken rope, a missed stroke, and his name would be cursed for years. No one remembered the perfect deaths, only the messy ones. Take Jack Ketch, infamous in 17th century England. His name became synonymous with botched executions. He once took multiple swings to behead Lord Russell. When he failed to properly kill the Duke of Monmouth, the crowd nearly lynched him. And yet he was not a monster. He was a man trapped in a role that offered no redemption. And like many, he died in disgrace. Executioners suffered in other ways too. Their families bore the shame. Their daughters were avoided. Their sons teased. They were barred from church sacraments, from guilds, from respectable society. Even their corpses were sometimes denied burial in consecrated ground. Because to kill even for the crown was to bear a stain the soul could not wash away. Some tried to reclaim dignity. Franz Schmidt, executioner of Nuremberg in the 16th century, kept meticulous records. Over 40 years, he executed 394 people and flogged hundreds more. Yet he saw himself as a servant of justice. He prayed for each victim. He lobbied for a pardon near the end of his life and received it. But how do you forgive a man for doing the job you gave him? By the 19th century, the job was changing. Executions moved behind prison walls. The gallows became hidden. The crowds vanished. But the curse remained. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most famous modern hangman, executed over 400 people, including war criminals after World War II. He was efficient, professional, detached. But later in life, he resigned. He believed, he said, that the death penalty did not deter crime. That even the cleanest hanging left blood on the hands of everyone involved. And that justice, once measured in death, eventually corrupts itself. Today, most of the world has abandoned public execution. Some have banned the death penalty entirely. But where it survives, so too does the burden. Because someone must still pull the lever, inject the poison, flip the switch, and then live with it, alone. The executioner stands as a reminder, not of justice, but of the cost of justice. The hidden weight behind every law, the pain behind every verdict. He is not the face of evil. He is the face we turn away from so that we can say we did the right thing. And that may be the cruelest curse of all. In Next, We move from the gallows to the fire, to the lives of chimney sweeps, children sent into soot-choked flues, their lungs blackened, their bodies bruised all, to keep the parlors of the wealthy glowing warm. The parlor is warm. A fire crackles behind the grate, casting a flickering glow on polished brass and thick carpet. The lady of the house sips tea. The children play in the corner. Everything feels safe, civilized, proper. But somewhere high above, in the cramped flue of that very chimney, a child is coughing, face pressed against soot-caked brick, hands raw, body twisted at an impossible angle. This is Tommy or Jack or Nell, names barely known to those who pay for the clean chimneys. And he is a sweep. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, especially across Britain, the job of cleaning chimneys was not done with brushes, nor handled by burly workmen. It was done by children. Tiny, underfed, desperate children, some as young as 5 sent into narrow, winding flues to scrape away soot with bare hands, knees, elbows, and the occasional rudimentary scraper. They were prized for their size. They were chosen for their disposability, and they were cursed from the moment they entered their first chimney. These child sweeps were often orphans or sold by impoverished parents to master sweeps adult men who ran the business and took in children as apprentices. The apprenticeship was little more than indentured servitude. They lived in filthy quarters, slept on soot sacks, and rarely bathed. Their clothes were rags. Their food was scraps. Discipline was harsh. Kindness was rare. They were known as climbing boys, though girls were sometimes taken too. And every day they faced the same black maze of choking dust and suffocating dark. A typical workday began before dawn. The sweepmaster would lead his apprentices through the streets, banging on doors, calling out for custom. Once hired, a child would be hoisted up into the chimney shaft, often with no idea how far it reached or how narrow it became. The flues could be crooked, twisting around corners. Some were barely 9 inches wide. Children became stuck, panicked, cried out. The only way was up, or down, or not at all. In winter, the bricks were freezing. In summer, they scalded. Soot filled the mouth and lungs coated the skin, rubbed into open sores. The children often coughed black for days. Some suffered burns from flues that were still hot. Others suffocated. There are countless reports of sweeps being buried alive in chimneys. Their tiny corpses only discovered when smoke refused to rise and families noticed the smell. Then there was the long-term cost. Constant inhalation of soot led to chimney sweeps' carcinoma form of scrotal cancer, first noted in the late 18th century by surgeon Percival Pott. It was the first occupationally linked cancer ever identified. Young sweeps barely into adolescence developed tumors from the carcinogenic ash caked into their bodies. Few lived long enough to grow old. Even fewer were mourned when they died. Despite mounting horror stories, the practice continued because chimney sweeping was necessary. Fires needed airflow, chimneys needed cleaning, and brushes didn't bend the way a starved 6-year-old could. Master sweeps argued it was character building that the boys were taken in, trained, and given work. Some even claimed they were treated like family. But the scars on the children told a different tale. Reform came slowly. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788 was the first to attempt regulation setting a minimum apprentice age of 8, but it was widely ignored. Further acts followed in 1834, 1840, and 1864, each attempting to restrict the use of child sweeps. But enforcement was lax, and the money kept flowing. It wasn't until 1875, after intense public pressure and the death of a sweep named George Brewster, that real change occurred. That year's act made it illegal to send any child up a chimney, and for once the law had teeth. George was 13 when he died in a flu at Fulbourn Hospital. His death shamed the nation, but how many others had passed unknown and uncounted? Today we celebrate the chimney sweep in folklore and song. In some traditions, they're seen as lucky symbols of renewal, of protection, of hard-earned fortune. We romanticize them, even turn them into charming characters in musicals. But the truth is grim. The child sweep was not lucky. He was used. His bones bent so others could breathe clean air. His lungs blackened so drawing rooms could glow. His name forgotten so the fire could burn bright. There are monuments now scattered across the UK and Europe. Statues of small children clutching brushes, eyes wide with soot-stained sorrow. And we remember them not for their profession, but for how little we cared until it was too late. In Next, we leave the rooftops behind and descend into the world of the plague doctors, those eerie, beaked figures of medieval lore, whose masks hid not just their faces, but their helplessness in the face of Europe's greatest fear. He appears through the smoke, drifting like a phantom. Long black robes sway with every step. Leather gloves cover his hands. A wide-brimmed hat shadows his brow, and from beneath it a long curved beak juts forward, glistening, grotesque, inhuman. He is not a demon, not a priest. He is a plague doctor, and in the eyes of a dying city he is both salvation and warning. During the Black Death and later plague outbreaks in Europe, from the 14th century through to the 18th, the plague doctor emerged as a grim icon of desperate times. But far from being a heroic healer or miracle worker, the plague doctor was often little more than a last resort, an administrator, a scribe, a human placeholder between the living and the dead. The role was formalized during outbreaks, especially in cities like Venice and Paris, where governments hired plague doctors to tend to the infected record deaths and help contain the spread. They were not in most cases physicians in the modern sense. Some had basic medical training, many did not. They were often young men seeking experience or old men with no other options. Some were prisoners, debtors, or second-rate healers drawn by hazard pay and desperation. Their duties varied. They examined patients, tended to the sick though true cures were non-existent, lanced buboes, applied leeches, burned herbs. They kept tally of the dead, signed death certificates, testified on inheritances when no one else could enter the house. In some cities, they helped quarantine families, locking doors from the outside and sealing windows shut. Sometimes they were the last face a person saw before the fever took them. And it wasn't always a comforting one. Their most infamous feature, the bird-like mask, was not decorative. It was in fact an early and ultimately ineffective form of personal protection. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, mint, camphor cloves, rose petals intended to purify the air and mask the stench of death. People at the time believed disease traveled through miasma, bad air, so if the doctor couldn't smell it, perhaps he couldn't catch it. The rest of the outfit followed similar logic. The hat a sign of medical profession, the cloak coated in wax or oil to repel bodily fluids. The staff used to prod patients from a distance or fend off desperate relatives. To the sick, the doctor looked like death incarnate. And often he brought no better news. Despite the image plague, doctors rarely saved lives. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. They prescribed dried toads, crushed emeralds, potions made from mercury, or even the blood of virgins. None of it worked. And many doctors died quickly, unable to protect themselves or truly help those in their care. Others survived simply by luck or avoided real contact altogether, focusing on paperwork rather than patients. Still, they served a purpose. In a time of chaos, someone needed to bring order, to write names, count bodies, burn belongings, close houses, to bear witness. They were paid by the state, given housing food hazard bonuses, but also forbidden from leaving during outbreaks. Some cities sealed them in with the plague, forbidding them to flee, because once you become a symbol of pestilence, escape becomes treason. The most famous image of the plague doctor, the eerie beaked mask and flowing robes, didn't appear until the 17th century, popularized by Charles Delorme, physician to the French royal court. Before that, doctors dressed more like monks or apothecaries. But the bird mask stuck. It became legend, and today it survives as costume tattoo and meme, a symbol of dread wrapped in absurdity. But in truth, the real plague doctors weren't gothic heroes or villains. They were helpless, men doing a job no one wanted, wielding no magic, only ink and ritual, trapped between science and superstition. And then there's the loneliness, because no one wanted to be near them. Not just for fear of infection, but because to see a plague doctor was to be reminded that death had already arrived. They weren't healers. They were harbingers. Even in modern pandemics, echoes of this stigma remain. Health workers ostracized, nurses avoided, frontliners burned out. The costume changes, but the fear stays the same. In literature and art, the plague doctor has become an archetype, cold, distant, enigmatic. But the real ones, they bled, they coughed, they despaired. And when the pestilence finally passed, when the doors were unsealed and life returned, they often vanished without thanks. No statues were built, no honor roll read, only silence. Next, we move from the cities to the forests, where tanners and leatherworkers boiled hides in urine and feces, living in stench and shame to clothe a world that refused to look them in the eye. If you had walked past the edge of town in a medieval village, you might have noticed the stench first. A thick, gagging odor, sour, rotten chemical, and oddly sweet. It clung to your nostrils. It crept under your clothes. It made your stomach turn. That was the tan yard. And the men who worked there, tanners, were some of the most essential yet reviled figures in pre-industrial society. Because while everyone needed leather boots, belts, harnesses, book covers, armor, one wanted to think about how it was made. Tanning leather was a process of alchemy, labor, and filth. It began with death. Hides were stripped from animal scouts, sheep, goats, deer, sometimes even dogs. The fresher the better, but fresh also meant bloody. The hides were soaked in water to soften them, then scraped with curved knives to remove flesh and fat. This was the easy part. Next came the dehairing, and for that tanners turned to urine. Yes, human urine. A natural source of ammonia, it helped loosen the hair and open the pores of the hide. Tanneries often had buckets placed in nearby towns with signs reading, "Please pee here for the tanner." People obliged, sometimes paid a penny per pot. The hides were left to soak in these piss-filled vats for days. The smell was unbearable. Once softened, the hair was scraped off. Then came batting, an even fouler stage. To further soften the leather and remove residual proteins, hides were soaked in a mixture of dog feces and water. No, you didn't misread that. It was called pure in the trade, an ironic name if ever there was one. Boys, often apprentices, had the job of stomping the hides barefoot in this mix. Imagine the feel, imagine the reek. Then at last came the tanning itself. The prepared hides were steeped in vats of tannin-rich liquid made from oak bark chestnut or sumac leaves for weeks or even months. This process halted decay, toughened the hide, and slowly transformed it into usable leather. But the work didn't end there. The leather had to be stretched, beaten, dried, oiled, and sometimes dyed. Every step was physical. Every step was filthy. And every step pushed the tanner further from respectable society. because of the smell. Always the smell. No amount of washing could scrub it out. It seeped into their hair, their nails, their teeth. It coated their skin. It followed them like a ghost. Tanners were often barred from churches, taverns, and markets. They lived on the outskirts, literally untouchable in some communities. Marriage prospects were poor. Social standing was worse. And yet without them, medieval life would grind to a halt. Think of everything made from leather in that era. Book bindings for monks, reins and saddles for knights, shoes for farmers and nobles alike, gloves, belts, aprons, water skins, even armor-boiled leather hardened into protective gear. And behind each item was a man up to his elbows in rot and bile. No artisan, no guild-honored craftsman, just a tanner. Bent-backed, thick-skinned, reeking of the trade. Some found pride in the work. It was a skilled profession after a loan that took years to master. And for those who ran their own yard, it could even be profitable. But that profit came at a price. Skin diseases were common, so were eye infections, respiratory illness, and rotting teeth. Apprentices often entered the trade before age 10. Many didn't last long. Those who did, they bore the marks for life. Even centuries later, the legacy of the tanner remains tainted. In some cultures, the surname tanner carries echoes of lower caste or polluted work. In others, old tan yards are still contaminated, the earth beneath them poisoned by lime and acidic runoff. Tanneries were pollution hotspots long before the Industrial Revolution. The only thing dirtier than the work was the way the world treated those who did it. And yet leather was everywhere. Kings wore tooled leather jerkins, priests read from calfskin-bound gospels. Soldiers marched in hobnailed boots. Every layer of society used the product, and collectively turned their noses up at the process. A hypocrisy as thick as the stench rising from the vats. Today, leather is still a major industry, but the tanning has largely moved offshore to poorer countries, where regulation is lax and lives are cheaper. And the old curse of the tanner, it lingers. Only now it's hidden behind factory walls and corporate logos. But someone somewhere is still standing barefoot in filth so that someone else can wear clean shoes. In Next, we delve beneath the earth into the coffin pits of plague burials, where grave diggers labored night and day to bury the dead before the air itself turned against them. They had no names, no records, and sometimes no masks, just shovels and time running out. The streets are quiet, but not from peace. Doors are shuttered, curtains drawn. Even the dogs have gone still. There is no bird song, no market noise, no children playing in the lanes. Only the slow creak of a wheelbarrow, the splash of lime, the scraping of a spade, and the mensolent soot-faced bent to their task. They are the plague pit diggers, and their job is not to save the living. It is to bury the dead before the city drowns in them. When pestilence strikes, real. Pestilence, the kind that topples cities and unravels the bonds of law. There is one task that becomes more urgent than all others. Disposal. The Black Death of the 14th century swept across Europe with a fury never before recorded, killing millions. But in its wake, it left something almost worse: bodies. Bodies in homes, in fields, in alleyways, in churches. And the task of removing them fell not to priests or physicians, but to the lowest of men. The grave diggers, the body bearers, the pit fillers. They were drawn from the fringes, criminals, paupers, former beggars, men who had nothing left to lose. They were often paid by the city if they survived long enough to collect. Some were conscripted. Others volunteered for a few coins, a stale loaf, or the right to loot the corpses. In many cases, they worked at night, dragging carts door to door. A cry would ring out, "Bring out your dead," and the doors would open. Sometimes the dead were ready. Sometimes the dying were thrown out with them. In towns overwhelmed by plague, traditional graveyards filled within days. So authorities turned to mass pits. Huge holes, sometimes the size of a house, dug on the outskirts or in plague fields. Bodies were stacked in layer slime sprinkled over each row to slow decay. But the lime stung the skin, blistered the eyes. The stench was unbearable. And the deeper the pit, the more treacherous the walls. Men slipped, some fell in. Not all came out. There were no coffins, no prayers, no names. Only the clatter of bone against bone, the dull thud of limbs landing on limbs, the ceaseless shovel scraping earth over face, over ribs, over mouths that would never speak again. Some pit diggers drank heavily. Others sang to block out the silence. Some wept. Most stopped feeling altogether. They wore little protection leather aprons, cloth masks soaked in vinegar, if anything. They learned quickly not to touch their faces, not to linger too long over a particularly grotesque body. Some wore herbs around the neck. Others crossed themselves before every shift. But death is not fooled by superstition, and the pit diggers were dropping fast. Yet the work never stopped, because the dead didn't wait. And as fear spread, so did cruelty. There are records of pit diggers robbed, stoned, or denied entry back into towns. They were seen as walking contagion, no better than the corpses they carried. They slept in huts outside city gates, and if they died well, there was always room for one more in the pit. In London, the Great Plague of 1665 saw entire parishes wiped out. St. Bride's Church reported more than 4,000 burials in a single summer. A single pit near Aldgate held over 1,000 corpses. And the diggers, they became infamous. Their boots left black trails. Their carts made children cry. Their faces were never remembered. But the city remained above ground because of them. Even centuries later, when new housing or rail lines were built, workers would stumble upon the remnants of those pits. Skeletons crammed together limb over limb, sometimes still wearing rings or shoes. Some had coins in their mouths, others rosaries in hand. All had been placed there in haste, buried by men who were never thanked, only feared. What made the job so cursed wasn't just the danger of the revulsion, it was the isolation. Pit diggers existed on the edge of humanity, doing work no one dared look at. They touched death every day, but were denied the dignity of even being mourned when death touched them. No one told their stories. No one lit candles for them. They simply vanished. And yet they were essential. Without them, bodies would rot in homes, contaminate wells, breed flies, attract dogs and rats. Without them, plague would spread faster, more violently. Without them, cities would collapse, not from illness, but from grief unburied. They carried not just corpses, but the weight of society's survival. And like so many throughout history, they bore it in silence. Today their bones are dust, their names lost. But in the DNA of every city, in the foundations of every churchyard and hospital garden, there is the memory of a time when the only thing standing between civilization and chaos was a man with a shovel. In Next, we return to the battlefield, but not for glory. We enter the blood-stained tents of wartime surgeons, where screams echoed through canvas and anesthesia was a prayer whispered too late. The cannon has fallen silent for now. Crows circle overhead, too full to caw. Smoke still clings to the grass. The air reeks of gunpowder, sweat and blood. And in a tent, barely standing against the wind, a man screams. He is one of many. There are rows of them, laid on stretchers, bare-chested limbs, wrapped in blood-soaked cloth mouths, agape in agony or shock. Over them hunch the surgeons, not angels of mercy, but weary, blood-spattered men with sleeves rolled up and bone saws at the ready. This is not healing. This is damage control. Before anesthesia, before antiseptics, before germ theory, battlefield surgery was an act of brutal necessity. When bullets tore through flesh or cannonballs shattered bone, there was little time, less understanding, and even fewer options. Amputation was the most common solution. Remove the limb, prevent gangrene, hope the patient doesn't go into shock. There were no scalpels of precision, only speed nerve and the thick leather of the surgeon's own stomach. Surgeons were often called sawbones, and the name was no exaggeration. In Napoleonic Wars, American Civil War fields, or Crimean front lines, a good surgeon could take off an arm in under 2 minutes. Some bragged of faster. The trick was tying off the arteries quickly and hacking through bone with clean strokes. No hesitation, no missteps, because a slow cut meant a screaming patient and a rising risk of death. There were no gloves, no sterilized tools, no antibiotics. A single knife might be used on dozens of men in an afternoon. Infection ran rampant: sepsis, tetanus, hospital, gangrene. A wound that today would heal with stitches and a saline rinse was back then a potential death sentence. The surgery itself wasn't always what killed you. It was what came after. In some cases, patients were given a swig of brandy, or a bullet to bite, or nothing at all. They were held down by orderlies, gagged, or left to scream into their own shirts. Some lost consciousness from pain, others remembered everything. And the surgeons, they had no choice but to press on, one after another. Blood soaking through their boots, flies buzzing over buckets filled with severed limbs. No time to pause, no time to grieve, only the next patient already turning pale. The conditions were horrifying even by contemporary standards. Tents were overcrowded, tools were left on dirty tables, wounds were probed with bare fingers. Pus was seen as a good sign, proof the body was expelling the poison. Nobody understood germs. Nobody washed hands between patients. Even the idea that bad air caused infection was more guess than fact. It wasn't until the work of Joseph Lister in the 1860s, long after countless battlefield deaths, that antiseptic technique began to spread. But by then, generations of surgeons had been baptized in blood with no protection. Many of them were not formally trained. In early wars, surgeons could be barbers, butchers, or apothecaries. Some learned their trade through apprenticeships, others on the job. Battle was the most brutal classroom imaginable, and the students often learned from mistakes they wouldn't survive themselves. The mortality rate for amputations during the American Civil War, for example, was as high as 45% higher if the surgery was done at the hip or shoulder. Not because of poor skill necessarily, but because no human body is designed to endure such violence unaided. There were stories of men waking up during surgery, of limbs thrown in piles, sometimes mistaken for the wrong patients, of surgeons operating for 48 hours straight without sleep, of hospitals so overwhelmed that wounded men lay on floors begging to be put out of their misery. And through it all, the surgeons kept cutting, because if they didn't, no one else would. The psychological toll was immense. Some broke down completely. Others became cold mechanical. A few were revered as heroes, but most were forgotten. They didn't die in battle, but they died with it, carrying the faces of the screaming, the groaning, the ones they couldn't save, and sometimes the ones they chose not to. Because battlefield triage meant deciding in seconds who had a chance and who didn't. And what of the patients? Some lived, many didn't. Those who survived often faced a life of chronic pain, infection, and disfigurement. There were no prosthetics as we know them today, only crude wooden pegs, metal hooks, or straps to bind sleeves shut. Some men became beggars. Others were hidden from view. Their suffering was inconvenient. Their survival often unwanted, proof of the war's true cost. Today, modern military medicine has advanced far beyond those dark tents and bloodied aprons. We have antiseptics, pain relief, reconstructive surgery, trauma therapy, but the image of the battlefield surgeon, stooped, exhausted, red to the elbows, remains carved into the bedrock of medical history. A figure not of mercy, but of grim endurance. A man who held the line between hope and horror with nothing but cloth, steel and will. In next, we head to the sewers to meet the night soil men and sewer hunters of Victorian cities who waded through rivers of human waste to keep civilization from choking on its own filth. And sometimes they never came back. It is midnight in London and the streets are quiet. Gas lamps flicker on corners. Carriages have long since stopped. Chimneys no longer smoke. But beneath the cobblestones, the city is alive. A sloshing, oozing underworld of stench and shadows. And within it, waist-deep in filth, move the night soil men, armed with spades, buckets, and an iron stomach. They are the silent workforce, holding back the tide of disease and ruin. And theirs is a job as foul as it is vital. Before the widespread adoption of underground sewer systems in the 19th century, most homes in cities like London, Paris, and New York relied on cesspits or privy vaults, deep holes dug beneath houses or courtyards to collect human waste. Over time, these pits filled, and when they did, someone had to empty them. Enter the night soil men, so named for their habit of working under cover of darkness. Not for mystery, but for shame. No one wanted to see the muck being carried out. No one wanted to know how their mess disappeared. They just wanted it gone by dawn. The work was backbreaking, filthy, and dangerous. Using long-handled dippers or buckets, the men scooped human waste night soil from the pits and transferred it into barrels, which were then loaded onto carts. These carts creaked through the empty streets to dumping grounds outside the city or to waiting barges on the Thames, all done while the city slept. By morning, the filth was gone, but so sometimes were the men. The dangers were many. Pits could collapse, the walls crumbling and burying workers alive. Methane and sulfur gases built up over time, especially in older cesspits. A single spark could cause an explosion, and more than once men simply suffocated, overwhelmed by invisible fumes. One step too far into a rotten plank and they were gone, swallowed by the very waste they came to remove. And yet there was worse. Beneath the streets, a new kind of scavenger emerged, the sewer hunters. These men delved deep into the combined sewer systems, a labyrinth of tunnels carrying not only human waste, but also industrial runoff, rotting animals, and the occasional corpse. By candlelight, they waded through filth looking for valuables. Coins dropped from pockets, cutlery flushed by mistake, jewelry teeth, even the stray pocket watch. It was called treasure hunting by some, but it was survival. And it came at a price. Sewer hunters faced not only disease and collapse, but predators of another kind. The tunnels bred monstrous rats, great slick creatures that could swarm a man if cornered. Some hunters carried knives, others dogs. And always they carried the knowledge that no one would come looking for them if they didn't return. They lived in the dark, and often died in it too. In 19th century London, the problem of human waste became a public crisis. Cesspits overflowed, sewers dumped into the Thames, and the river, once a lifeline, became a stinking ribbon of death. The smell was so bad in the summer of 1858, it became known as the Great Stink and forced Parliament to suspend sessions. Disease followed cholera, dysentery, typhoid, all traced back to contaminated water. The very filth the night soil men and sewer workers tried to control was killing the city anyway. It wasn't until engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed a new sewer system, miles of brick tunnels beneath London, that things began to change. By the 1870s, the new system diverted waste away from the Thames and greatly reduced disease. The night soil men slowly faded into history. Some found other work, some didn't. But their efforts, filthy, thankless, and vital, laid the foundations for modern sanitation. And the job was not just disgusting, it was socially damning. Night soil men were shunned, children ran from them, women avoided eye contact. Their clothes stank, their skin was stained, the smell followed them everywhere. They lived on the fringes, physically and morally separated from those they served. Their wages were meager, their hours long, their deaths unmourned, and yet they were the hidden backbone of urban life. The reason disease didn't spread even faster, the ones who cleaned up after civilization so it could pretend to stay clean. Today we flush and forget. Modern plumbing hides the truth. We live in sanitized comfort, unaware of how close we once were to drowning in our own filth. But beneath every city lies a ghost, the memory of a time when sanitation was a human task done with shovel and grit and a nose held shut. And someone somewhere is still doing it. In Next, we scale dangerous heights into the world of the steeplejacks, those who repaired towering cathedrals and chimneys with no harness, no net, and only the wind for company. Because when God's house needed fixing, someone still had to climb. Look up. Higher. No higher still. There above the rooftops, past the clock face and the weather vane just beneath the sky itself, you might spot a figure small as a bird clinging to the side of a cathedral spire or the edge of a smoking chimney stack. That is a steeplejack, not a tradesman, not an acrobat. Something between a daredevil and a ghost. A man who earns his coin dancing with death hundreds of feet above the ground, with little more than rope, wooden ladders, and a prayer. Steeplejacks emerged in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries as cities grew taller and industrial chimneys punched into the sky. They were tasked with inspecting and repairing structures that no one else dared to touch. Church steeples, factory smokestacks, clock towers, lightning rods, weather vanes and flagpoles. Their work combined masonry, carpentry, and climbing, all done while balancing in the wind with no safety regulations and very few second chances. They built their own ladders, wooden hooked and often homemade, and lashed them together as they ascended. Some drove iron spikes into masonry to anchor ropes. Others simply trusted the stone. Their tools dangled from belts. Their boots slipped on slate. Their fingers froze on iron. There were no harnesses, no scaffolds, no helmets, just the open air and the long fall below. The dangers were obvious. Falls were frequent and fatal. One wrong step, one crumbled brick, one loose rung of rope, and a man would plummet to the cobblestones. There were no nets, no ambulance, only a wooden cart and a priest if you were lucky. The wind was a constant enemy. Gutters slick with rain, chimneys slick with soot, and the structures themselves, often damaged, unstable, or warped by lightning, could crumble beneath your grip. Steeplejacks worked alone or in small teams. There were no radios, no help from below. If something went wrong, you had only yourself and gravity. But the pay, surprisingly decent, because no one else wanted the job. Factories and parishes would pay handsomely to keep their chimneys drawing, their clocks ticking, their bells ringing. Some steeplejacks became semi-famous in their towns, admired from afar, spoken of in hushed tones. Children pointed. Adults watched nervously. Few dared make eye contact with the man who hung like a spider over their Sunday service. Some were drifters, others craftsmen born into the trade. There were dynasties of steeplejacks' fathers teaching sons, passing down secrets about knotwork balance and reading the wind. They learned how to test bricks with a knock, how to walk a roof line with their eyes closed, how to brace their body against the twist of a rope in sudden gusts. They became part of the skyline, and sometimes they disappeared into it. One of the more famous steeplejacks, Fred Dibner, came from Bolton, England, and brought brief public attention to the trade in the 20th century, with his chimney demolitions and fearless climbs clad in flat cap and overalls, smiling as he dangled above the void. But he was an exception. Most were unknown. Unphotographed, buried in work clothes, their stories left at the top of a tower somewhere. The job wasn't just physical. It required nerve. Imagine fixing a crack in a church bell's frame while the wind howls, or standing on a smoking chimney top while soot billows up from below. Some steeplejacks worked during storms. Others carried out emergency repairs on fire-damaged buildings while the walls still smoldered. If a weather vane bent or a clock stuck, someone had to climb, and no one but the steeplejack would. In industrial towns, the job grew more dangerous. Tall chimneys belched toxic fumes, acid rain corroded brick. Some steeplejacks came down coughing black. Others didn't come down at all. And yet the trade persisted, because as long as people built up, someone needed to maintain the heights. And while birds and angels watched from the rafters, it was a man with calloused hands and a sack of tools who kept the city from crumbling. Eventually, new laws and safety measures transformed the trade. Harnesses, steel scaffolding, regulated inspection crews. But the early steeplejacks had none of this. They were freelancers of the sky, forgotten in history books, remembered only in the bones of towers they kept standing. And perhaps in the feeling we get when we stand on a high ledge, toes curled, wind in our face. That strange blend of awe and terror. That's the steeplejack's world. In Next, we return to sea, into the bilges and bows of wooden ships, where powder monkeys and coal trimmers worked in smoke soot and suffocating heat, fueling the engines of empire with their bodies. The sea was never silent. It creaked, hissed, groaned wood against wave rope, against sail, steel against wind. Above decks, the officers barked orders and surveyed the horizon with telescopes in hand. But beneath the decksin, the smoke-choked guts of the ship Other men and often boys toiled in darkness, forgotten by history, crucial to victory. First the powder monkeys, later the coal trimmers, both condemned by size class or poverty to jobs so dangerous and so thankless even the sea itself seemed kinder. Let's begin with the powder monkeys, small boys aboard sailing warships, especially in the 17th to 19th centuries. Their job was simple to describe and deadly in practice: deliver gunpowder to the cannons. Each broadside of a ship required precise timing and fast reloading. Every cannon had a crew, and that crew needed powder delivered in heavy cartridges, often wrapped in canvas or flannel. The ship's powder magazine, where gunpowder was stored, lay deep in the hull, far from enemy fire. It was a place of strict silence. No sparks, no shoes with nails, no lanterns, only dim lamps inside glass. The powder monkeys would fill their satchels or trays and dash up narrow ladders to deliver it. Over and over again. Most were between 10 and 14 years old, small enough to fit in the ship's tight spaces, light enough to move quickly. Many were orphans, poor, press-ganged from ports or born into naval families with no say. In battle, they ran through smoke and chaos, dodging splinters and blood cannon recoil, and shouted orders. If they stumbled, if a cartridge was dropped, it could mean detonation. A ship's entire side could be blown apart from within. Some boys exploded before they ever knew what hit them. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. They had no training, no protection, no glory. Only the scream of the boatswains, whistle, the smell of salt and blood, and the crushing expectation that they would keep going until the guns fell silent, or they did. Some were awarded medals. Most were not even listed on muster rolls. Their lives were counted in battles, not years. As steam replaced sail and navies transformed into iron fleets, the job of powder monkey faded, but its spiritual successor emerged in the coal trimmer. When steamships ruled the oceans during the Industrial Revolution and well into the 20th century, coal was king, and coal had to be fed. Tons of it every day. Coal trimmers were the men who managed that supply. Their job, live in the bunker's massive coal storage chambers on either side of the ship's boilers. They worked by candlelight, shoveling coal toward the firemen who stoked the furnaces. If the ship wasn't balanced, if the coal wasn't distributed evenly, the vessel could list dangerously or even capsize. Trimmers were responsible for that balance. They worked in suffocating heat, often shirtless, black with dust, crawling over mountains of coal as the ship rocked and pitched. There was no ventilation, no escape from the heat, no clean air. The pay was meager, the hours endless, and the job deadly. Coal bunkers could collapse, burying men alive. Others succumbed to black lung, their breath slowly robbed by decades of soot. Some were scalded by burst steam pipes. Others were simply cooked bodies found near furnaces too close for too long. No ocean breeze reached them, no sunlight, just heat noise and the ever-present tremble of machinery above. They were the ship's heartbeat, unseen but essential. In wartime, they worked through torpedoes and firestorms. In peacetime, they labored just the same. No medals, no parades, just blisters, burns, and blackened skin. When the Titanic sank in 1912, 163 of her coal trimmers and firemen were lost. Most were never found. They died doing what they always did, keeping the lights on, even as the sea claimed them. There was a strange solidarity among these men. They shared boots, food, cramped hammocks in foul air. They sang songs, coal shanties full of black humor and gallows pride. They knew they were replaceable, but they also knew that without them, the great machines above would fall silent. And perhaps in the roar of engines, that knowledge sounded a bit like respect. Today, automation and cleaner fuels have eliminated many of these roles. Ships are quieter, cleaner, more efficient, but the sea still remembers. And if you listen closely to the hull of an old warship in a museum or the clank of steel in a naval dockyard, you might hear echoes of bare feet on wood, the shuffle of a coal shovel, the hurried breath of a boy in the dark carrying powder toward thunder. In Next, we rise into the skies to meet the human computers and balloon observers whose roles in war and science were often overlooked, yet who risked death or madness with every mission. Because not all cursed jobs were done in the dirt. Some were done in the clouds. History tends to remember the men who soared, the pilots, the daredevils, the aces. But before flight became heroic, it was deeply precarious. Before satellites and drones and radar, those in charge of watching the enemy had to float, tethered above the battlefield, dangling in canvas and silk. And those who calculated the trajectories of missiles or charted the stars. They did so with chalk and slide rules, often hunched in silence, underpaid, overworked and forgotten. Let us now look up to two cursed professions born of the skies: balloon observers and human computers. The balloon observers. In the mid-19th century, military strategists realized that gaining the high ground no longer meant just a hill. It meant the air. During the American Civil War and later in World War I, observation balloons became vital tools. These gas-filled leviathans were tethered behind the lines, manned by one or two individuals who rose high above the battlefield with telescopes, radios, or signal flags in hand. Their job: spot troop movements, report artillery positions, adjust firing coordinates in real time. It sounds simple, but it was one of the most suicidal assignments available. Balloons were enormous, obvious, vulnerable. Enemy pilots hunted them. Snipers targeted them. Even artillery fire was directed their way. And when the balloon was hit, which happened often, it didn't explode like in the movies. It burned. Hydrogen used to keep it aloft was highly flammable. A single incendiary bullet could turn the entire structure into a flaming death trap. Observers had parachutes, but they were primitive. More than one man was tangled in cords or caught in updrafts only to land behind enemy lines or not at all. To make matters worse, the basket suspended below the balloon was little more than a wicker coffin. No armor, no cover. You floated high above, entirely exposed, often for hours at a time. Your only defense was your altitude and a revolver if you were lucky. Some officers took cyanide with them, in case they fell behind enemy lines and needed to avoid torture or betrayal. And yet balloon observers were essential. Their reports changed battles. Their bird's-eye view allowed for coordinated artillery barrages, saved infantry lives, and revealed enemy tactics. But they received little recognition, because their heroism wasn't loud. It was elevated fear swallowed with every gust of wind. 2. The human computers. Back on the ground, another war was being fought, not with rifles or ropes, but with numbers. Before modern computing, everything missile trajectories, bomb plots, naval routes, astronomical calculations had to be done by hand. By human computers, many of them were women, and many of them were worked to the bone. In labs, observatories, military bunkers, and government agencies, they sat in rows, sleeves rolled, pencils sharp. Their calculations had to be flawless. An error of 1 decimal point could mean the failure of a rocket or the misfire of a bomb. There was no fame in it, no glamour, just notebooks, silence, and pressure. During both world wars, women in Britain and the US were recruited into roles once closed to them, handling everything from radar analysis to gunnery plotting. In the RAF WAF, radar plotters tracked the movements of enemy aircraft in dark rooms, guiding pilots to intercept and strike. They listened to the skies through headphones, watched signals flicker across rudimentary screens, called out bearings while bombs fell around them. Their reward, often nothing, sometimes less than nothing. In the US, NASA's early space missions depended on black women like Katherine Johnson, whose calculations put men on the moon. But they were called computers, not scientists. Their names rarely appeared in the reports. They worked behind closed doors, their efforts absorbed into the glow of others. And still they came back each day, because someone had to do the math. And machines then couldn't be trusted. Being a human computer was exhausting. Long hours, tiny errors punished, no recognition, often paid a fraction of their male counterparts even when doing the same work. They were seen as machines, not minds. Yet every ship guided, every missile fired, every star mapped came from the minds of the forgotten. We now live in an age of automation, GPS satellites, and quantum computing. But the first great leaps into the sky and beyond, they were paved by those who looked up. Those who counted, those who braved fire or numbers or both. The balloon observer scanning the horizon through smoke. The woman at her desk squinting over log tables and memorized constants. Both watching, both calculating, both cursed with jobs that demanded everything, while giving little in return. In Next, we return to the surface into the poisoned fields of chemical factories and radium watch dials, where workers glowed in the dark and didn't yet know they were dying. They thought it was beautiful, the way it shimmered in the dark. A faint, ghostly green, the real, almost divine. It was the 1910s, and radium was the wonder of the age. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie, it was hailed as a miracle substance. It cured illness, lit watch dials, added glamour to cosmetics, even appeared in health tonics. And it glowed. In a world still half lit by gas lamps that was enough to capture the public imagination. But as with many wonders, the glow came at a cost. And the ones who paid it were the Radium Girls factory workers who painted watch dials with radioactive paint day after day until their bones collapsed from within. The job. During the First World War, luminous watch dials became vital for soldiers in trenches and pilots in cockpits. To make them glow, they were painted with radium-based paint called undark or lunar light. Precision was key. The numbers and hands had to be small, detailed, perfect. And so factories across the United States and Europe employed young women, mostly between 14 and 22, to paint them. They were nimble, careful, and in the eyes of employers, disposable. The women were taught a technique called lip pointing. They would twirl the fine camel hair brush between their lips to create a sharp tip, dip it into the radium paint, and repeat, over and over, hundreds of times per day. Some girls added flourishes, painting their nails, teeth, even faces for fun before dances. They giggled in the mirror as they glowed faintly in the dark. It felt like magic. But it was murder in slow motion. The symptoms. At first it was toothaches, then abscesses, gums that bled, teeth that fell out, leaving behind holes that oozed and refused to close. Doctors were puzzled. Then came jawbones that crumbled when touched. Women began to limp. Radium had settled into their bones, mimicking calcium. Their spines curved, their hips fractured. Some developed massive tumors. Others wasted away, unable to eat, their bones slowly dissolving from the inside. They were glowing and dying. Management denied responsibility. Factory doctors blamed syphilis, calling the women immoral. Even as workers dropped dead, the companies refused to admit the paint was to blame. After all, the radium was good for you, wasn't it? It took years and extraordinary courage for the women to fight back. In the US, 5 women from the US Radium Corporation sued their employer in 1927. They were already dying when the case went to trial. Too weak to sit in court, they gave testimony from their beds. The company's lawyers tried to delay, hoping the women would die before the verdict. They almost did. But in a landmark decision, the court ruled in favor of the workers. It was the first time an American company was held responsible for occupational illness. Their names, Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and others, should be etched into history as pioneers of workers' rights, because their victory laid the groundwork for workplace safety standards we take for granted today. And yet the glowing poison didn't stop there. The factory poisoners. Elsewhere in chemical plants and industrial facilities, workers were exposed to mercury, arsenic, lead, and asbestos without warning or protection. In the early 20th century, men in dye factories stirred vats of aniline with their bare arms. Women in match factories developed phossy Jawa, rotting of the face caused by white phosphorus. The Canary Girls of Britons. Munitions factories during World War I handled TNT and other explosives, their skin turning yellow, their health deteriorating rapidly. And in asbestos plants, workers inhaled fibers that would later cause slow, suffocating deaths from mesothelioma decades after their exposure. These were not accidents. They were known risks, often hidden or ignored by employers. The logic was simple. It cost less to replace a worker than to protect one. But the Radium Girls, their case struck a nerve because of the cruel irony. They glowed. The very substance that made them valuable marked them for death. There was no hiding it, no denying it. Their bodies became proof, living, dying evidence that something was terribly wrong. Even in death, they were radioactive. To this day, many of the radium girls' graves emit trace radiation, their bones still laced with the element that killed them. They were buried glowing. Eventually, public outcry, lawsuits, and scientific breakthroughs forced industries to adopt safety measures. Protective gear, ventilation systems, labeling of hazardous substances, training for chemical handling, and perhaps most importantly, accountability. But the suffering of those early factory workers reminds us that progress is too often written in pain. Their jobs were not glamorous. They weren't soldiers or politicians. Just ordinary people, mostly poor, mostly young, who took the only work they could find. And in doing so, they lit a fire that changed laws, medicine, and industry. They were cursed, but they were also catalysts. In Next, we come to the final chapter, a reflection on what ties these cursed jobs together, the invisible thread of sacrifice, injustice, and resilience. We'll ask what makes a job truly cursed, and what can we learn from those who did them? What makes a job cursed? Is it the danger, the filth, the neglect, or is it something deeper sense that those who held these roles were used up by society and then quietly forgotten? Over the course of this series, we've walked the battlefields and coal bunkers, scaled steeples, and descended into cesspits. We've met plague doctors, leech collectors, rat catchers, matchstick girls, and miners. We've watched children shovel powder under cannon fire, and women glow to death in factory rooms. And now, here at the end, we must ask, why were these jobs necessary at all? The truth is that cursed jobs often arise not from cruelty, but from necessity. Human civilization is a strange thing. It builds upward, shining with progress and pride, but its foundations are often buried in blood, soot, and silence. For every cathedral that stretches to the sky, there's a man who fell off the roof. For every clean city street, there's a night soil man who waded through excrement at 3 a.m. For every glowing watch dial, a girl who painted it with her mouth. The real curse. The real curse was never just the danger. Humanity has always risked injury for survival. The deeper curse was this: they were expected to suffer quietly. There were no memorials to the coal trimmers who suffocated below deck. No stained glass windows for the steeplejacks. No history books for the widows of tunnel diggers or match girls or balloon observers. They were told to be grateful for work, to accept pain without complaint, to risk their lives for someone else's comfort and then vanish. That's the curse, not the job, but the expectation that someone else's life is worth more than yours. But they persisted, and yet they worked. They woke before dawn. They stood in freezing rivers. They touched chemicals with bare hands. They stared down plague, fire, and death. Why? Because someone had to. Because a child needed feeding. A house needed rent. A family couldn't afford to lose another day's wage. Many of them didn't consider themselves brave, but they were. Courage doesn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it's just showing up again tomorrow when you know what the day will bring. Lessons for the present. We live in a different world now, one with laws, safety codes, unions, and awareness. But the shape of cursed labor remains. It hides in sweatshops and gig economies. It walks among delivery riders in storms, warehouse workers timed to the second sanitation crews who disappear into alleys before sunrise. The faces change, the names change, but the equation remains. Someone suffers, so someone else doesn't have to. And as long as that equation holds, the stories of these workers past and present must be remembered. The quiet legacy, every cursed job left behind a legacy. The radium girls helped spark health and safety laws. The chimney sweeps helped usher in child labor reforms. The powder monkeys taught us the value of precision under pressure. The plague doctors, leech collectors, and resurrection men forced medicine to evolve. These were not glamorous contributions, but they were transformative. We do not live in a cleaner, safer world despite these people. We live in one because of them. Who cleans the world? A final thought. Next time you walk on a clean pavement, flush a toilet, check the time on your luminous watch, or stare out over a city skyline. Ask yourself, who built this? Who risked everything for me to have it? Who bore the weight so I didn't have to? The answer is not in monuments or headlines. It's in the invisible hands that kept civilization running while no one was looking. The cursed ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who deserve to be remembered. Epilogue, a worker's whisper. If you listen, you might still hear them. In the creak of a lift shaft, the clang of old pipes, the hum of underground trains. They are not ghosts, not really. Just echoes of people who worked in the shadows and built the world.